The plastic case hits the floor first. Then the sound of glass cracking. My daughter's hands are shaking. Her insulin pen is broken open on the airplane carpet. Clear liquid spreading across gray fibers like something dying. A woman in a cobalt blue blazer stands over the wreckage, chest heaving, eyes wild with a rage that makes no sense for the size of the offense. "I don't care what it is," she screams. "Get that medical garbage off my armrest." My daughter is 11. She is crying without sound, the way kids do when they've learned that crying loud gets punished worse. I kneel down. My hands find the shattered pen case. My mind finds something colder. Somewhere behind my ribs, a switch flips that hasn't flipped in years. I look up at this woman. She doesn't know what she just did. She doesn't know who she did it in front of. But to understand why this moment changed everything, I need to take you back to where this all began. 6 hours earlier, I was standing at gate 14 with a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching my daughter Ren read the same page of her book for the third time because she was too nervous to focus. She had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 2 years earlier, right after her 9th birthday, and every trip since then had become a small military operation. Insulin pens counted twice. Glucose tablets in 3 different pockets. A doctor's letter folded into a plastic sleeve, ready for security checkpoints that sometimes treated her medical kit like contraband. I had done this drill more times than I could count, and I still felt my stomach tighten every time we walked through those metal detectors. This trip was supposed to be simple. A visit to her grandmother in Denver, for days of mountain air and pancakes. Nothing more complicated than that. My ex-husband had wanted to come along too, but work made that impossible, so it was just the two of us, father and daughter, boarding pass in one hand and her tiny gray insulin case in the other. 20 years of training had taught me to read a room before I ever said a word in it. I scanned the gate area out of habit, the way I scan every room I walk into, cataloging exits and faces and anything that felt out of place. Nothing did. Just tired travelers and a toddler asleep on his father's shoulder, and an older couple sharing earbuds to watch something on a tablet. Ren tugged my sleeve and asked if the plane would have a window seat for her, and I told her I'd already requested it twice. She smiled for the first time all morning. That smile was the whole reason I did any of this. Not the job, not the training, not the years of rooms I couldn't talk about. Just that smile, and the promise I made to keep her safe enough to keep smiling. The gate agent called our boarding group and we shuffled forward with the rest of the tired herd. Ren held her insulin case against her chest like other kids hold stuffed animals. I noticed the badge clipped inside my jacket pocket press against my ribs as I leaned down to grab her backpack, and for half a second I felt the familiar weight of it, heavier than it should have been for a piece of laminated plastic. I pushed the thought away. Today wasn't a work day. Today was just a father and his daughter and 4 days of pancakes waiting on the other end of a 2-hour flight. We found our row without trouble, 14C and 14D, and Ren slid into the window seat with the kind of quiet joy that only children have left for small things. I stowed her insulin case in the seatback pocket in front of her, within easy reach, exactly the way her endocrinologist had taught us. The cabin filled slowly around us with the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday flight. Rolling suitcase wheels, overhead bins slamming, a baby fussing 3 rows back. It was, for a few minutes, the most peaceful kind of ordinary. I remember thinking that this was exactly the trip we needed. I remember being wrong. She came down the aisle like she owned the plane before she'd even shown her boarding pass to anyone. Late 40s, maybe 50, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and a cobalt blue blazer with matching trousers that looked expensive and somehow still cheap in the way she wore them. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Her sunglasses stayed on even after she boarded, pushed up into her hair like a crown she refused to take off. I noticed her before she noticed us, the way you notice weather turning before the first drop of rain falls. Her first stop was 2 rows ahead of us, where a young flight attendant was helping an elderly man lift his bag into the overhead bin. "This is taking forever," she snapped, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Some of us have places to be." The flight attendant apologized, the elderly man apologized, and the woman in blue rolled her eyes so hard I could practically hear it. She didn't wait for a response. She simply pushed past both of them and continued down the aisle, heels clicking, blazer swaying, entitlement radiating off her like heat off summer pavement. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever does at first. Then she stopped at our row. She looked at Ren's window seat like it had personally wronged her. She looked at the tiny gray insulin case tucked into the seatback pocket like it was something offensive to her eyes. And she looked at me, sizing me up the way people do when they're deciding whether you're worth the fight. I felt the dread settle in before she said a single word. I had seen that look before in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and it never meant anything good was coming. "That's my seat," Karen announced, jabbing a finger toward 14D, where Ren was sitting with her book still open in her lap. I told her, calmly, that her boarding pass showed 15D, one row back, and that I'd be happy to help her find it if she wanted. She didn't want help. She wanted a fight. "I always sit in 14, she said, voice rising, drawing eyes from 3 rows in every direction. "I don't care what some kid's ticket says." Ren's fingers tightened around the spine of her book. I kept my voice level and told Karen that we'd booked this seat weeks ago for a medical reason, that Ren needed the window for airflow and space to manage her supplies. Karen's eyes flicked to the insulin case again, and something ugly moved behind them. A flight attendant arrived to smooth things over, gently confirming that seat 14D did belong to us, and offering to help Karen find her assigned seat 1 row back. Karen refused to move. She crossed her arms and planted her heels like the aisle itself belonged to her. And when the flight attendant tried again, Karen's voice dropped into something quieter and far more threatening. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she said, leaning close enough that the flight attendant took a half step back. I felt my jaw tighten. I told myself this was nothing. I told myself to let it go, to keep the peace, to get Ren to Denver without incident. I had no idea yet how wrong that hope would turn out to be. 3 minutes later, everything changed. Karen finally moved to 15D, but not before shooting a look back at Ren that could have curdled milk. She sat down hard enough that the whole row shook, and immediately began complaining to the passenger beside her about entitled families who thought medical excuses meant special treatment. I heard every word. I said nothing. Ren, to her enormous credit, went back to her book like nothing had happened, though her hands were not quite steady on the page. For a while, things settled. The plane pushed back from the gate. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens. Ren pulled out her insulin pen to check her blood sugar before the drink service began. The same small ritual she performed 4 or 5 times a day without complaint, without drama. The quiet discipline of an 11-year-old managing a disease that never took a day off. She pricked her finger, checked the number, made a small satisfied nod, and reached for her insulin case to prepare her dose. That's when Karen leaned across the aisle from row 15, craning her neck to see what Ren was doing. "Is that a needle?" she said, loud enough for the entire cabin section to hear. "You cannot be doing drugs on this plane." Ren froze mid-motion, humiliation flooding her face in a way that made my chest ache. I told Karen, evenly, that my daughter was managing a medical condition and that nothing about it was her concern. Karen's face twisted into something between disgust and delight, the particular joy of a person who has just found a target. "I have a right to feel safe on this flight," she said. "I don't know what that kid is doing over there, and frankly, I don't want to find out." A woman across the aisle, older, kind-faced, gently told Karen that the girl was simply checking her blood sugar, that plenty of children manage diabetes this way every single day. Karen ignored her entirely, eyes locked on Ren like she'd found something to win. A man 2 rows up muttered something about people minding their own business, and Karen's head snapped toward him with a look sharp enough to cut glass. She was outnumbered in opinion and growing louder because of it, not quieter. I noticed a young man near the back lift his phone slightly, angling it in our direction, recording without announcing that he was recording. I filed that detail away the way I file every detail, quietly, without reaction, the way 20 years of training had taught me to do. I made a choice in that moment. I chose calm. I chose to keep my voice level, to keep my hands still, to let Ren finish her routine without further comment from me that might escalate things further. Inside, something else was happening entirely. A slow tightening coil that I recognized from long ago. from rooms where staying calm wasn't a virtue but a survival skill. I breathed through it. I told myself that Denver was still 2 hours away, and that peace, however uncomfortable, was still the better choice for now. What I didn't know yet was that Karen was only getting started. The drink cart arrived, and with it, a fresh audience for Karen's performance. She flagged down the flight attendant immediately, gesturing wildly toward our row. "I want that family moved," she announced. "I paid for a certain kind of flight experience, and I am not going to spend 2 hours worried about needles and blood near my seat." The flight attendant, a woman probably not much older than 30, tried to explain gently that medical devices were permitted and protected, that nothing about Ren's routine violated any policy. Karen cut her off. "I don't care about your little policy," she snapped. "I know people at this airline. I will have your job by tonight if this isn't handled." The flight attendant's composure cracked slightly, the particular exhaustion of someone who has heard this threat 100 times and knows it rarely goes anywhere, but still has to treat it seriously because sometimes it does. She promised to speak with the lead flight attendant. Karen sat back, satisfied, like she'd already won something. Ren looked at me with wide, frightened eyes, silently asking whether we were actually going to be moved, whether this stranger's anger was powerful enough to displace us from our own seats. I told her no. I told her nobody was moving her anywhere. I did not yet know how badly I would be tested on that promise. Karen's targeting grew sharper and crueler by the minute. She began speaking about Ren in the third person, loud enough to be heard, as though the girl couldn't understand English. "I just don't think it's appropriate," she said to no one in particular, "to expose other passengers to that kind of thing. What if she has some kind of disease that's contagious?" Nobody even asked. A ripple of discomfort moved through the surrounding rows. The kind-faced woman across the aisle spoke up again, firmer this time, explaining that diabetes was not contagious and that Karen's comments were cruel and unnecessary. Karen rounded on her immediately. "And who asked you?" she snapped. "Mind your own business before I have you removed too." The man 2 rows up stood partway from his seat, phone still recording, and said loudly that he had never seen an adult behave so poorly toward a child. Karen's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, she leaned further into her rage. She unbuckled her seatbelt despite the seatbelt sign still being lit, and walked the 2 steps to our row, standing over Ren with her hands on her hips. "Move that disgusting kit," she said, pointing at the seat back pocket where the insulin case sat. "Before I move it myself." I stood as well, placing myself calmly between Karen and my daughter, keeping my voice low and even. I told her that the kit was staying exactly where it was, that her seat was 1 row back, and that I needed her to return to it immediately. Karen's eyes narrowed to something I recognized instantly, the look of a person who has never once faced a consequence in her life and cannot fathom that today might be different. And what Karen did next made even the flight attendants stop breathing. Karen shoved past me, grabbed the insulin case from the seatback pocket, and threw it to the cabin floor with both hands, hard enough that the pen inside cracked open on impact. Insulin spread across the carpet in a thin, clear pool. Ren gasped and reached for it instinctively, and Karen shouted at her to stay back from your little drug kit. The cabin went eerily quiet for half a second, the specific silence of dozens of people realizing simultaneously that something had gone too far to undo. I knelt down beside my daughter, checking that she hadn't been hurt in the scramble, my hands finding the shattered case, my mind finding something colder than I'd felt in a long time. Ren was crying without sound, shoulders shaking, eyes fixed on the broken pen that represented hours of careful preparation and, more urgently, a dose she now had no way to take. Karen stood over both of us, chest still heaving, apparently pleased with herself, apparently unaware that she had just crossed a line that no apology would ever fully repair. I looked up at this woman in her cobalt blue blazer, and I felt every year of my training align into a single quiet decision. She had no idea what she had just done. She had no idea who she had done it in front of. The cabin fell into an uneasy hush that seemed to press down on every passenger at once. I could hear the recirculated air hum through the vents, the faint rattle of the drink cart still parked in the aisle. My breathing stayed slow and even, a discipline built over decades, even as my pulse thudded once, hard, against my ribs. Ren looked up at me, her small hand still hovering near the shattered pen case, waiting to see what I would do, waiting the way children wait when they trust an adult completely to make things right. I stood up slowly. I made eye contact with Karen, and I did not look away. She met my gaze with a flicker of confusion, the first crack in her certainty, as if some part of her recognized that the man in front of her was not reacting the way targets of her tantrums usually reacted. I spoke for the first time since she'd thrown the case, and my voice came out quiet, controlled, final. "You need to sit down," I said. "Now." Karen laughed, short and sharp, tossing her hair back with a flick of her wrist. "And who do you think you are?" she said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. I reached into my jacket pocket. My fingers found the familiar edge of laminated plastic, the badge I had carried for 20 years, the one that had felt heavier than usual that morning without my understanding why until this exact second. I drew it out slowly, holding it up at eye level, not for the cabin, not for an audience, but directly for her. A woman 2 rows back gasped audibly. I heard a phone lower somewhere behind me, the recording forgotten in favor of witnessing something with unfiltered eyes. Karen's gaze dropped to the badge in my hand, and I watched her face change in stages, the way ice changes when it starts to crack from the center outward, slow at first, then all at once. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. "My name is Director Alan Hastings," I said, quietly, without a trace of triumph in my voice. "I run counterterrorism operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. That little girl you just assaulted is my daughter." The color drained from Karen's face so completely that for a moment I thought she might actually faint where she stood. Her hands, moments ago so confident throwing a child's medical equipment to the floor, now hung useless at her sides. She opened her mouth again, and this time words did come out, tumbling over each other in a desperate scramble. I wasn't, you can't possibly, there's no way you're actually." I cut her off with a single sentence, spoken as calmly as everything before it. "Sit down, and do not speak again until law enforcement arrives." A man near the back of the cabin, the one who had been recording earlier, said what everyone else seemed to be thinking without daring to say aloud. "She just assaulted a diabetic kid in front of a federal agent," he said, disbelief thick in his voice, "and threatened a flight attendant's job for doing her actual job." Karen said nothing. She simply stood there, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with the sudden, total collapse of whatever false authority she had been operating under for the entire flight. Her false power was gone, and everyone in that cabin section had watched it disappear in real time. The lead flight attendant arrived within moments, alerted by the commotion, and I identified myself again, calmly, precisely, the way I had briefed hundreds of officials over the years. I explained what had happened in clear, unembellished terms. The destruction of my daughter's medical equipment, the verbal harassment, the physical altercation over federally protected medical devices. I mentioned, without raising my voice, that at least one passenger had recorded portions of the incident on their phone, and that I would be requesting that footage be preserved for the report. Karen attempted one last defense, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier venom. "She didn't even ask permission to have that stuff out," she muttered, gesturing weakly toward the ruined insulin pen still lying on the carpet. "I have rights too, you know." Nobody responded. The silence that met her words was its own kind of verdict, more damning than any argument could have been. The captain came on the intercom minutes later, his voice steady and official, informing passengers that local authorities would be meeting the aircraft upon arrival due to a reported in-flight incident. A ripple of quiet applause moved through several rows, restrained but unmistakable, the sound of an entire cabin section exhaling relief they hadn't realized they were holding. Karen sank into her seat, blazer suddenly looking smaller on her frame, sunglasses still absurdly perched in her hair. No longer a crown but a forgotten accessory nobody was looking at anymore. I turned my attention back to Ren, kneeling beside her again, checking her hands and her face for any sign of injury beyond the emotional one. She was shaking, but she nodded when I asked if she was okay, and I pulled a backup glucose meter and emergency supply kit from my carry-on, the redundancy I had built into every trip precisely because the world sometimes broke things you needed. I administered her dose carefully, murmuring reassurance the whole time, and slowly her shoulders began to unclench. When the plane landed 40 minutes later, the process of consequence began exactly the way it should have. 2 airport police officers boarded before general deplaning began, and I met them at the front of the cabin, briefing them calmly and precisely with the same detail I'd give any incident report. I noted the timeline, the destruction of medical property, the harassment, the threats made toward airline staff. I gave them my credentials and my direct contact information, and I gestured toward the man near the back who had recorded portions of the confrontation, offering his footage as corroborating evidence. Karen tried, one final time, to minimize what had happened, telling the officers it had all been a misunderstanding, and that she had simply been startled by medical equipment. One officer glanced at the shattered insulin pen still visible on the cabin floor, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, "you are being detained for destruction of property and endangering a minor's medical care. You'll need to come with us." The words landed in the cabin with the weight of finality, and I watched Karen's face crumple into something that no longer resembled entitlement, only fear. Passengers murmured as she was escorted down the aisle, her heels no longer clicking with confidence but scuffing awkwardly as an officer guided her by the arm. Nobody offered her sympathy. A few passengers actually turned away, refusing to watch, as if her presence had become something distasteful to witness even in defeat. Ren watched from her seat, still holding my hand tightly, and when Karen passed our row, she didn't look at either of us. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, cobalt blue blazer suddenly looking like nothing more than fabric. The cabin after Karen was gone felt lighter in a way that was almost physical, as if the air pressure itself had changed. Passengers who had been silent throughout the ordeal now spoke freely, some laughing quietly with relief, others simply exhaling long breaths they seemed to have been holding since the confrontation began. The elderly man from the earlier overhead bin incident made his way back to our row, resting a gentle hand on the seat back in front of Ren. "You handled that with more grace than most adults I know," he told her, and Ren managed a small, tired smile, the first real one since the pen had shattered on the floor. I checked Ren's blood sugar again, watching her numbers steady into a safe range, watching the color slowly return to her cheeks. She leaned her head against my arm and asked quietly if we were still going to see Grandma today. I told her yes, that nothing about this changed our plans, that we would be in Denver eating pancakes by dinner just like we'd promised each other. She nodded slowly, processing, and then asked the question I'd been expecting since the badge came out. "Dad, you never told me you did that kind of work." I told her the truth, that some things were hard to explain to an 11-year-old, and that today had simply been the day the explaining became necessary. She accepted this the way children accept most impossible things, with a kind of trust that made me grateful all over again for the life we'd built together. A woman a few rows up stopped by our seats before deplaning, the one who had spoken up earliest in Ren's defense. She told me quietly that she had a grandson with the same condition, and that watching someone stand up so calmly for a child had restored something in her she hadn't realized she'd lost faith in. I thanked her and meant it because moments like that mattered more in the aftermath than they ever seemed to in the middle of a crisis. Ren listened to the whole exchange with wide, thoughtful eyes, tucking the memory away the way kids do with things they don't fully understand yet but know are important. By the time we reached the jet bridge, the mood in the cabin had shifted entirely from tension to something like quiet camaraderie. Strangers who had shared an ordeal together nodding at each other with unspoken understanding. I thought, as we finally stepped off the plane into the terminal, about how strange it was that the worst 10 minutes of the flight had somehow also revealed the best in nearly everyone around us. The world, I found, tends to do that. It shows you cruelty and kindness back to back, close enough together that you can't mistake one for the other. The weeks that followed brought the kind of resolution these stories rarely get to see play out in full, but this one did. Karen, whose full name turned out to be Deborah Whitfield according to the police report, was formally charged with destruction of property and endangerment related to interference with a minor's medical device. The airline, once the footage had been reviewed and my report filed, issued her a permanent ban from all future flights on their carrier, a consequence she reportedly fought and lost. Local news outlets picked up portions of the bystander footage, and within days, clips of her outburst had circulated widely enough that she was let go from her position at a regional marketing firm, citing conduct unbecoming of a company representative. Ren healed from the experience faster than I expected, in the resilient way children often do, though she asked for a spare insulin kit to be packed in 2 separate bags on every trip after that, a request I honored without hesitation. She started telling the story herself eventually, first to her grandmother over pancakes that same evening, then later to her classmates, framing it less as something scary that happened to her and more as proof that grown-ups could stand up for what was right when it mattered. I noticed she started speaking a little more confidently after that, a little less afraid to take up space in rooms that weren't built with her in mind. For me, the experience clarified something I'd known abstractly for years but never felt so sharply. All the training, all the rooms I couldn't talk about, all the years of staying calm under far worse pressure than an airplane cabin. None of it had ever mattered as much to me as it did in that single moment kneeling beside my daughter on a floor covered in spilled insulin. The badge in my pocket had always represented duty to something larger than myself. That day, it represented something smaller and infinitely more important instead. One unexpected outcome emerged from the incident that neither of us anticipated. The airline, in response to public attention around the case, updated its staff training protocols regarding medical devices and passenger harassment, citing our flight specifically as a case study for how quickly de-escalation can fail without proper intervention. A representative reached out weeks later to thank me for the detailed report I'd provided, noting that it had directly shaped new guidelines meant to protect other families like ours in the future. It was a small thing, in the grand scope of everything, but Ren beamed with pride when I told her that something good had grown out of something so frightening. Now, months later, Ren still keeps her insulin kit zipped tightly whenever we travel, but she no longer flinches at strangers who glance her way on planes. She has learned, perhaps earlier than any child should have to, that not every stranger's anger deserves her fear, and that sometimes the quietest people in the room are carrying the most weight. I think about that flight often, not with anger, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because it reminded me why I chose the life I chose, and why I would choose it again in an instant if it meant protecting the people I love most. Some people mistake calm for weakness. They see patience and assume it means someone won't fight back when it matters. But real strength was never about volume or threats or blazers pressed sharp enough to intimidate strangers on a Tuesday flight. Real strength is quiet. It waits. It protects what it loves without needing an audience. And it only reveals itself the moment cruelty forces its hand. If the story reminded you that dignity outlasts entitlement every single time, you already know what to do.